just heard from Mark Rutte there, but we've also heard from Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, saying that international law is clear. All temporarily occupied territories belong to Ukraine. What are we going to see on Friday? How likely is it that Zelensky is going to be presented with a deal that forces him to hand territory over to Russia?
Yes, good morning. I think this is the great fear in Europe and in Kiev. President Trump has been talking in terms already of land swaps. Putin and Trump are going to meet in Alaska, which is about as far as you can get from Ukraine and Europe. And the fear in the capitals in Europe is that they're going to carve out a deal which will agree to hand over essentially a large part of Ukrainian territory to Vladimir Putin. And the risk is that they have very few levers to influence President Trump at this point. Europe is not going to be at the table. There's still some arguments about whether President Zelensky is going to be invited to Alaska. And so they're left somewhat clutching at straws, talking about international recognition and principles of temporarily occupied Ukrainian land. But essentially, possession is 9/10 of the law, as we know, and if Putin has possession of this territory and Trump is willing to leave him in possession of that territory, it's very difficult to see how Ukraine's going to push back.
Well, of course, you had European leaders trying to get involved with this, hosting the US Vice President J.D. Vance in the UK over the weekend. But, if Trump puts Zelensky in a deal or no deal scenario, Tony, and Zelensky chooses no deal, can Europe make up for the lost US support militarily?
Well, they've had 3.5 years to get ready for this, and there's no great sign, in fact, that they've made good use of this time. They are still very heavily reliant on the US for weapons sales. If you remember, President Trump said he wasn't willing any longer to give weapons to Ukraine, but he was willing to sell them to Europeans to provide weapons to Ukraine. And some of the comments from Vice President Vance over the weekend even put somewhat of a question mark over that. So essentially, the Europeans are left with a difficult task of trying to put a brave face on whatever deal comes out of Friday's summit, and it's very difficult to see how they'll be able to step in and replace US weapons sales. Simply in some instances they just don't have those types of weapons, and in others they don't have the necessary quantities, and so they're going to be left with a very difficult position of saying that they support Ukraine, but in physical military terms not really being able to step up to the plate.